Edward tells a lie. James was cross. Shunting for a slow goods train indeed. It's ridiculous, he chanted. You're never happy, are you, James? Edward smiled. Only because the fat controllers put me on goods work, James puffed. They said I was getting too big for my wheels. Me! He banged some trucks into a siding. Take care, James, Edward cautioned, or else you'll get into trouble. Ha! Snorted James. What do you know? And he reversed sharply. Come along, he barked to the trucks. But the trucks didn't come along. They bounced off his buffers and rolled into a brake van, which carried on running through a wall. Oops, said James. Yes, said Edward. Whoops. The fat controller came to the yard. James, I am ashamed of you, he said severely. You can stay in the shed until I can trust you again. James looked like he was going to cry. Edward spoke up. Actually, sir, it was my fault. The fat controller raised an eyebrow. I am surprised, Edward. I thought you would take more care shunting. Well, you know how it is, sir, James cut in. Edward is so old and weak and pathetic that something was bound to happen. I suppose. The fat controller looked between the two engines. Perhaps, Edward, you should go to the yard and reacquaint yourself to trucks again. James can run your branch line. James was horrified. The branch line? But, sir... James? Yes, sir. And so, while James ran his branch line, Edward went to the big yard. Duck was happy to see him. I'm glad you're here, Edward. We've been so busy, it's nice to have an extra pair of buffers. Don't go causing any accidents, mind, sniffed Henry. We don't care for, carelessness, Edward finished. Don't you worry about me. It was James who had the accident anyway. Duck was surprised. Then why did he blame it on you? He didn't. I blamed it on me, replied Edward. Oh, I see. Beg pardon, of course, but that'll come back to bite you on the buffers, said Duck. I know, lying isn't a very honest thing to do, sighed Edward, but it felt like the right thing at the time. Edward and Duck worked well together and shunted trucks and coaches happily for the rest of the week. Even so, Edward was glad when the inspector came to tell him that he was going home. You'll be double-heading with James a goods train, he said. He's waiting at the harbour. Yes, sir, said Edward. He wasn't looking forward to seeing James. I don't like the positioning of that bogey bolster, said Edward, eyeing a long flatbed in the middle of the goods train. Don't you worry, just get on with it. Edward had hoped he'd be a little humbler, but James was just as impatient as ever, making me pull trucks, making me run a branch line, making me shunt. You might not have been doing anything at all, said Edward sternly, and that shut James up right there and then. James's train was a fast freight to the other railway. He was making a special stop at Edward's station to drop him off. James didn't like having to do that at all. Come on, he barked. No hurry, Edward grinned. We'll have to do some smart work so that I don't miss my path, James retorted. But he needn't have worried. With the two engines pulling the train together, they made excellent time. They were approaching the station when Edward saw the signal diverting them onto the slow line. Oh, he cried, we're being shunted. Both engines braked hard, and the trucks bumped into each other. Ho, 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 they cried. The empty flatbed was squeezed between the heavy trucks and finally jumped, placing its buffers on top of the ones of the truck in front of it. One bump and it would come off badly. The bogey bolster, oh no, exclaimed James. It'll come off at the junction. But Edward knew what to do. Keep your brakes off and the trucks will push us over the points. That'll keep the buffers close together so that the train doesn't derail. The weight of the heavy train pushed them on and they rocked over the points. Edward's idea worked splendidly and the flatbed didn't come off. Edward and James applied their brakes and came to a gentle stop. Both engines let out a sigh of relief. It had been very close indeed. I do not like my engines having accidents so frequently, the fat controller thundered. Edward, You work well in the yard, but you cannot be trusted on the main line. Edward, shamefaced, looked at his buffers. It was my fault, sir, said James. I was hurrying. He paused, and then said, I should have known better, sir, after derailing those trucks last week. The Fat Controller stared. He spun on his heel and pointed at Edward. Why did you cover for him? It was only a mistake, said Edward. The Fat Controller thought for a second. My engines tell the truth, he said at last. I understand your feelings, but do not approve of your actions. Actions, he said impressively, have consequences. He strolled away. Thank you, Edward, whispered James, for sticking up for me. I know it's gotten you into trouble and all, but that's all right, James. Thank you for owning up. The Fat Controller's consequences were sent down to the shed. Duck was sent to Edward's branch, and Edward and James were sent to the yard with strict instructions that James was to learn how to shunt properly. And while he wasn't a good student, James did learn a little. Eventually.